There are a couple of misconceptions about prison that are pretty commonly held, and I blame the media because TVs and movies just push these ideas any chance they get. One is that rape in prison happens just all the time, that any place where there's some privacy in an institution, one inmate is raping another. I've done a video on this. And at least in my experience in the California prison system, sexual assault simply doesn't happen. Or if it does happen, it's so rare that I didn't hear about it at all. Another misconception is the idea that there are innocent men claiming that they're innocent at least, all over prison, that there are no guilty men in Shawshank, as it's termed. In reality, in my 17 years of incarceration, I think I met about a dozen guys that claimed that they were innocent. To be clear, I don't mean that they were over-sentenced or that somebody lied in court and their trial wasn't fair. I mean where they're claiming that they committed no crime whatsoever, that they are innocent men. A claim like that is very rare, and then even of the dozen or so guys who made that claim, there were only 3 in the entirety of my incarceration that I really believed were telling the truth. At some point in the future, I plan on doing a video on each of these 3 men. Douglas Lunsford, Ty Abreu, and Adrian Torres. I'm saying their full names because I feel that if I have a reasoned belief that these guys are actually innocent and serving time in prison, it behooves me to talk about them whenever I can. If I have an audience, I should be trying to get their names out there at least a little bit. The final misconception is the idea that escapes from prison are this commonplace occurrence, or at least that planning an escape is commonplace. That on any given high-security yard, there are 4 guys planning to go over one of the fences, and somewhere else in the prison there's somebody tunneling out, and this just is not true. In reality, high-security facilities, the state spends billions of dollars making sure that they're inescapable, and for that amount of money, you better believe they get what they pay for. I never heard of anybody escaping. I never knew anybody who had escaped, or even knew anybody who had known somebody who escaped from a level 4 yard. Of course, lower security facilities, level 1 yards for instance, do have regular escapes. Whenever you see on the news inmates escape from California prison, it's generally one of these level 1 yards. They're also called walkaway yards. The reason for this is that there is very little security on these yards. Some of them have just a chain link fence around the exterior of the yard. And this is because the inmates on these yards are only serving a very small amount of time, a couple of months, maybe a year. So if they escape, it's not that big of a deal. In fact, if they had just waited the extra couple of months, maybe a year, they could have just walked out the front gate instead of sneaking over the back fence. Generally, whenever there is an escape from one of these yards, it comes down to a lack of impulse control. That an inmate got an idea in his head that he needed to go home right now, he couldn't stay in prison any longer, and so he escaped. This costs them years more of incarceration, and of course they're invariably caught and brought back. But this lack of impulse control, this inability to delay gratification, is very common amongst inmates. I remember reading about something called the Marshmallow test, which is an experiment that was done back when, where they would give a child a marshmallow, leave the room, tell them if you can go just a couple of minutes without eating that marshmallow, whenever we come back in the room we'll give you a much bigger treat. And they'd watch the child to see how he dealt with the prospect of having to delay gratification, having to not eat the treat even though he wanted to because he wanted the greater treat. Needless to say, inmates would do very poorly on this test by and large. I remember one cellie that I had, Doug. Doug was very different from a lot of my cellies in that he and I barely got to know each other. Most of the stories that I tell, these are people that I knew really well. I read their paperwork. We lived in rooms for years at a time sometimes. I knew Doug for 2 days. I moved into the cell. He was getting ready to be transferred out of the institution to another institution because he had a drinking problem and had gotten in trouble too many times for drinking. He was there for about a day and a half, 2 days, and they came and got him and put him on a bus. I barely had time to know anything about him. But we did discuss his commitment offense. Now, a lot of the stories that I tell, I know they're true. You know, I looked into the background, I talked to the guy for weeks at a time, I did my research. Doug I had to take on face value. I didn't have time to really do the research on who he was, so it's possible he was lying outright. But he claimed he was very wealthy. He claimed that his family had millions of dollars and that prior to his arrest he'd had a summer home and a normal home and multiple cars and more women than you could wave a stick at. Maybe it's true. If we're being honest, I don't care, but it made the fact that he was incarcerated for grand theft auto, fleeing arrest, and vehicular assault very interesting. I know he was in on those charges because looking at somebody's commitment offense is a very important part of being their cellie. You have to know what they're in for in case they're in on some funny stuff. I asked him, I said, Doug, you stole a car? And he was a little abashed, well, yeah, I stole a car. And I asked him, why? Why in God's name, if you were as wealthy as you say you are, would you steal a car? His explanation was that he had been leaving a club and the valet had the keys to a very nice Lamborghini kind of dangling in his hands. He saw an opportunity and he snatched those keys and leapt into the Lamborghini and went peeling out of the club. And I stop him at this point and say, well, Doug, why would you steal a car if you're as rich as you say you are? Couldn't you have just bought a car? I mean, I know a Lamborghini is an incredibly expensive vehicle, but you said you had millions and millions of dollars, right? And Doug looks me dead in the eye and he says, well, yeah, but I didn't want a car a couple of weeks from then. I wanted that car right then. And he goes tearing down the highway. What makes this event different than the other times, because apparently he'd done this more than once, is that this time the police happened to be called and they happened to find him driving that Lamborghini and hit the sirens. This is an opportunity for Doug to pull over and defuse the situation and just get into a little bit of trouble. He has lawyers and money. He'll be just fine. But here's that impulse control, because he gets the idea that if he just punches the gas, they can't ever catch him. And he ends up plowing into another vehicle, going way too fast because he loses control of this precision vehicle. I know nobody was killed because Doug was charged with vehicular assault rather than vehicular manslaughter. But he got in enough trouble that he, I guess, had to go to prison, even with his money, even with his lawyers. And this is assuming that any of this background information is true. All I know is what his charges were. In reality, I'm very hesitant to believe it whenever an inmate tells me that he's wealthy, which a number of inmates had told me over the course of my term. It's a common lie. Oh yeah, I'm a millionaire and I got guns and money and drugs and hey, can I borrow a couple of soups, maybe a jar of coffee, I'll pay you back honest. I'm always very skeptical that somebody who I know is probably a liar because they're in prison is also very wealthy and telling the truth about being very wealthy and not lying about it. Doug started his time on a 1 yard, but he liked to drink and he kept buying alcohol and getting caught with alcohol because he was really bad at hiding the fact he was drinking. And so, little by little, his points had been jacked up. He went to a 2 yard, a 3 yard. Finally, I met him on a 4 yard, and he was only there for a short period of time because he was apparently being moved to some kind of rehab facility prior to his parole. You know, I'm using terms like impulse control, delayed gratification. In reality, these are just terms for a type of accountability to yourself. It's real easy to not take that couple of bucks out of your paycheck and pay down your credit credit card debt. Instead, you can buy a couple packs of cigarette and keep smoking, even though you know it's bad for your heart and your lungs and it's making it so you can't breathe right. But you'll regret it tomorrow, because that's really what delayed gratification boils down to, is whether you're going to do something today that you enjoy, or whether you're going to be somebody tomorrow who did the right thing. So the next time that you're confronted with a hard choice, whether you want to have fun or plan for the long term, take a moment. Ask yourself who you really want to be. Do you want to be the person who did the easy thing, the fun thing, and regrets it? Possibly for the rest of your life. Or do you want to be the person who planned ahead, made the right choice, and gets to enjoy the easy life that comes from delayed gratification?